sponsored originally by Air India, but for reasons I'll explain, I never went back. However, when I went there, I was taken in charge by the tourist office, and they said, well, what do you want to do especially? And I said, well, it is a book about, you know, $5 a day books, so I have to pretty much cover the country, but there are two personal things I'd like to do. One is I'd like to go to the Sugandhi dupe factory, because everybody I know has Sugandhi dupe incense. And secondly, I'd like to meet Russi Karanja, who was the publisher of a million-selling tabloid called Blitz. And a history professor at Princeton, I have to read this, referred to Blitz as its self-proclaimed role as racket buster, exposing truth concealed by the powerful, with its staples of the embezzlement of public funds, prostitution rackets, sordid stories of seduction and sex in the name of spiritualism, dark political designs behind high-sounding rhetoric and the fleecing of the poor. So I thought, this is the paper I've got to see. So they took me to see Russi Karanja, who was a very genial fellow and very successful, and he said, the reason why I know that I'm a success is because I've been banned entry in Russia, and I've also been banned entry in the United States. I thought, well, that makes sense. So I went to the Sugandhi dupe factory, and it wasn't really a factory, it was just an unpaved area, like a parking lot, in which guys were sat on the haunches dipping incense sticks in this stuff and holding it up to dry, and that was the Sugandhi dupe incense factory. And I researched them recently, and they're still around, the Sugandhi dupe incense factory. So anyway, one of the things I got from Blitz was a story that the defense minister in India, whose name I have here somewhere, well, it doesn't matter, but anyway, he had known about Gandhi's coming or assassination and had chosen not to say anything about it, according to this story in Blitz, which of course I reprinted in my underground paper and was constantly and was permanently banned from India by the tourist board right afterwards. I mean, I don't mean they banned me from India. I mean, I couldn't expect any future help from the tourist board, and so of course Fromer never sent me back, because Fromer never did anything that he had to pay for unless he could help it. So anyway, the next thing that happened was that I had met this woman on the subway, and something about her really drew me to her, and it wasn't sexual. In fact, I knew her for 30 years, and we never so much as hugged that I remember. But something about her made me feel I had to meet her, but I didn't really feel I could go up to her and accost her, so I wrote about her in my column. I said, well, there's this woman on my subway. and the next time I saw her, I said, do you read the Village Voice? She said, sometimes. I said, well, read page 2, because I wrote about you, and then I ran away again. Next time I saw her, this was Elizabeth Pepper, who was a witch. And I mean, she was really a witch. I mean, she knew all about every natural force. She was an editor at Gourmet magazine at the time. She knew about every conceivable herb that was ever grown, every cure for anything. I mean, a genuine witch in the sense that one of the wise women of the past that you would have gone to when there weren't many doctors around. And she, I got her to write a column for my underground paper, and eventually she said to me, I want you to be co-editor with me of the Witches Almanac. It's an annual I'm going to start. This is the Witches Almanac. And so I used to write a column for that, and whenever I went to other countries like Greece, and the Nemesis story is a perfect one, researching the origins of King Arthur, not what the French wrote in the 9th century about King Arthur, but what the monk Nennius wrote in the 4th century about King Arthur. Really thorough research about magical things. And that really got me into a study of magic, to the extent that Betty and I managed to sell to the publisher, a British publisher, a book about magical sites of Europe. I was going to do all the travel and writing, and she was going to stay back home and pick out artwork and give me hints and all the rest of it. And so I went to see my friend Randy. Randy is a magician, a stage magician, and he became famous because he trashed Uri Geller when he's bending spoon stuff. And Randy has had a standing offer of like $1 million to any of these so-called people like that who can do magical things to do it under his observation. In other words, if they will take this true test and pull off this trick, he'll give them $1 million. Strangely enough, the offer's been open 20 years and nobody has yet got the $1 million. So what he does is he exposes frauds and stuff. And the reason I knew him was that I used to go on his radio show, his midnight radio show, and talk to people all night that called up and stuff. So when I got this commission to do this book about magic, I went to him and he said, and I was very proud of it and very excited. And he said, oh, what a lot of bullshit. He said, it's just nonsense. He said, anybody that claims magic, I can reproduce that for you. And we argued about this for a while. And I said, well, you know, you trashed Uri Geller, but he did bend spoons. And not only that, he can bend a medico key. A medico key was a particular New York latch key that was so hard, you couldn't conceivably bend it if you hit it with a hammer. And he said, do you have a medico key? And I reached into my pocket. And I said, yeah, give it me. So I gave him the medico key, and he, of course, diverted my attention. And he bent the key. So he wouldn't explain how he did it. And next time I saw him, I said, oh, I found out how you did that, Randy. I said, I learned that magicians carry this piece of very, very hard material in the palm, and they can bend things against it. He said, oh, what a typical journalistic explanation. But he still didn't explain how he bent the key. Anyway, so I started to do this book, and I put an ad in Time Out in London. I was living in this loft in London, in Notting Hill. And I put an ad, I said, it was an ad for a heavy lady, because that was the phrase we used in those days. A writer seeks heavy lady to assist in doing a book about travel and magic. And come up to, and I gave the address of the loft, come up here anytime after 10 o'clock next Thursday.
Well, what did heavy lady imply?
Heavy lady, somebody was really, you know, really up to date and everything, a real hip chick, basically.
Oh.
Yeah.
It was heavy.
Yeah, heavy.
No.
And so all day long people were coming, and it was like a day-long party. And somebody would turn up with a very fancy sweater, and somebody else would turn up and say, "My cousin knitted that. Where did you buy it?" You know, the one place that they sold it, this woman had bought. And they would make each other coffee and talk to each other. And I had two women specifically. But I also hired a lot of others to do research, because they said, well, what kind of research do you need? And I said, well, what in the subject of magic interests you? And one woman would say, well, white horses. A white horse is magical. And I said, well, why don't you spend a day, like 7 hours maybe, researching white horses, and I'll pay you a day's whatever, $20 maybe. And that way I can hire all kinds of people, you know, and give them all small sums of money and get a lot of things researched, and also check out which ones were any good. But I hired Sally, partly because she was very sweet and very anxious to help, mainly because her father was the Queen's secretary. He wasn't actually the secretary, he was like the civil service guy who was responsible for that particular area of the Queen's activities, handling affairs or desk or whatever. And I handled Martha, and I had Martha because Martha is a woman who was then about 22, and her father built the arch in St. Louis. Her father built it, Saran designed it, but her father was the contractor who built it. And she had gone to London at this very young age because she had heard about swinging London and she wanted to be part of it. So I said, well, you know, before we start on this magic book, I promised that I would go back to Cannes, the Cannes Film Festival, and do this paper I did last year called In the Can. And it was a gossip paper, and I have some here.
Wow.
It was like this size, little paper called In the Can. When you opened it up, it sort of would be You know, like this. This would be a copy in the can. So the two women would spend all the day wandering around, interviewing people, picking up information. I remember that, who was the guy that did, famous names always escape me. Taxi driver.
De Niro?
Yeah. No, the
Scorsese.
Scorsese was there and nobody would interview him. Nobody had heard of him, nobody cared about him. So we interviewed him, but you know, nobody cared about him. And I remember trying to interview Altman, and he was a real bastard, a real arrogant son of a bitch who would race all the time when you were trying to interview him. He would keep running, so you'd have to run beside him and, you know, try to interview him. And so we put out in the can, and nothing ever came of that. It wasn't meant to, but we were able to tap some of the worldwide reporters who were there covering the can for various countries, and they would write stuff for us and so on. So it worked out quite well, that in the can. So then we set off doing this magic book. Martha and I set off doing this magic book. And one of the things that one of the places I did research was the University of London Library had a special magic section. And in that section were 14,000 books gathered by a guy called Harry Price. And Harry Price was a famous ghost hunter in the 30s. He was a real friend of Fleet Street. They loved doing stories about his ghost hunting. He would set off with all his equipment, Borley Rectory or wherever, and come back with all this ghost stuff, you know. So so I got to know the curator of this locked part of the museum, where these 14,000 books of magic were, and nobody used it. So he would give me the key, and I would take a can of soda, and a bottle to piss in, and a blanket, and a sandwich, and I'd go up there and I'd spend the whole day doing research on all these great books, and nobody disturbed me, and of course couldn't copy anything, I had to write it down, and so on. But it was fascinating. And one of the books that I found, and I regret to this day that I didn't do something about it, or at least copy the name of it, was a book 2 or 3 centuries old, which explained all the magic tricks. Every magician must know about it, but I didn't, and I've never seen it since, or found anybody who could tell me where it was. But it was fascinating. But of course I was very busy researching real magic, so it didn't really take up very much of my time. Let me see, I have to consult my notes occasionally, not because I forget things, but if I don't get them in the right order, it's kind of confusing. We now almost, well, we're about at the, I think we're about 1965. And I met this girl called Sherry, and I got along very well with her, and I had to go to Japan and revise my book. And I went to Japan, and when I came back, she was living with somebody else, a guy called Walter. And so I called her up and I said, look, you did promise you do that thing in the 25-cent photo machine for me, because I want to write it in my column. And she said, well, I'll do it, but Walter has to come. And it was a 4-picture story called The Singing Titogram. And I had this French Legionnaire's hat, which she held over her breast for 3 pictures, and then put on her head for the 4th picture, exposing her breast. So it's a nice little 4-picture story. Well, of course, Walter and Sherry and I got totally stoned. And Walter said, you know, I'm starting a newspaper. I'm starting a paper in the East Village. And I said, oh, I'll write a column for you, you know, just out of the blue. You know, and he said, oh, great, okay. So I did a column for him. It was called The East Village Other, this paper. It was the first underground paper in New York. And by that time, there was already a newspaper, an underground paper in California, in LA, called the LA Free Press, run by a guy called Art Kunkin. And they had been carrying my column. And there was a magazine in Sydney, Australia, called Oz, and they were also carrying my column. And anyway, so Evo started, and Ed Fancher of The Voice called me and he said, you can't write for that paper. He said, if you write for that paper, you can't write for The Voice. And I said, well, really? I said, there are a lot of people who write for The Voice and write, well, you can't write for the East Village Other. He said, you have to make up your mind. Do you want to write for them or us? And I said, I'll write for them. He said, you better be sure about that, because you might want to come back. I said, I'll never want to come back. I've been doing my column for The Voice for 10 years. For the last few, she hadn't been paying me anything. So I went over to the East Village Other, and Walter immediately listed me, on the masthead as edited by William Randolph Hearst and John Wilcock. So I started editing the East Village Other, and I knew I wasn't going to be there very long because I had to go back somewhere, Japan or Greece or something or other. By this time, Walter had gotten fascinated by Tim Leary and had decided to go up and spend some time at Millbrook. But I had, he had done a wonderful cover. He did a wonderful cover of LBJ dressed in a Hitler uniform. And we were going to run it as a front page. And he came back from Millbrook, totally whizzed out with acid for 3 days. And he got this cover and he tore it up. Well, I had suspected something like that might happen, and I had copied it. So I put out the paper.
With that.
And here it is.
Wow.
Wow.
Oh my God.
You know, I would like to butt in and tell a story. I mentioned at the beginning that my first published comic strip was in the East Village Other in '69, and when I would go into the offices, which were above the Fillmore East, which was the big rock, place, they would have stacks of the old issues, and I found a whole big stack of #1, Volume 1, #1. So being a collector, I took a few, and I went out to a bookstore on 8th Street in the East Village, and there were some underground comics there that I wanted. So I said to the guy behind the counter, I'll trade you a copy of Evo, East Village Other #1, for these comics. And he said, oh my God, last night I had a dream that I got the first issue of the East Village Other. Just a weird, funny story.
Incidentally, the first issue of the East Village Other was very, very unconventional, because Walter had learned very early about printing offset and what you could do with it. And he had got this large sheet of paper, and he'd made up the paper all over this and folded it. And the center of it, stories went around in the center. It was very strange, the first issue, East Village Other. So anyway, I edited that for a few weeks, and then I went out to LA on the way to Japan, and Kunkin said, well, will you edit the LA Free Press for a while you're here? And I said, no. I said, I'm through with that. I fought with Walter over Evo, and I don't want any more of that stuff again, because he wanted to superimpose his vision of what an editor could do on me, and I was supposed to be the editor. And Kunkin said, well, you can be editor. You can do whatever you like. And I said, well, does that mean I can throw out your writers and bring in mine and change the heads and change the stories? And sure, you have total freedom to do anything you like. So I pulled in this friend of mine, John Bryan, who'd been doing a little paper in San Francisco and had just been hired, had just been kicked out of the Hearst paper in LA over some scandal over the Christ trial picture that he'd got involved with. I don't know the details. And so we started editing the LA Free Press. Well, it was a very, very magical time, because there were youthful riots on the Strip, and the Doors were lighting my fire, and we all went up to San Francisco, and were absolutely stunned as we went into Golden Gate Park to find everybody was in robes, sandals, and necklaces. And it was the first gathering, and probably the first time in history anywhere in the world, when the only thing all these people had in common were they were heads. They smoked dope, or they'd taken some drug or other. This was the whole point of San Francisco being, which I think the Motherfuckers, the group called the Motherfuckers, had delivered an incredible load of acid that everybody took. And Leary was there, and Ginsberg was there, and there were speakers and people being stoned. It was fabulous. And in retrospect, I realized that those riots on the Strip of young people complaining were probably the beginning of what we now see in the world, which is a youthful revolution took over for the first time. It was the first time in history anywhere, where young people had power and used it. And they got power because they came out of school and they picked up a guitar, and in no time they were making millions of dollars. So they were rich, they were famous, they were powerful, and everything about the youthful revolution dates from that time, and it began on Sunset Strip in LA, in my opinion. So anyway, I went to Japan. I revised the book once again, and I decided that it was time to do a paper myself. Oh, by the way, the each village other was responsible for the phrase "Black Power." Stokely Carmichael gave a speech talking about black power, and we had this big "Black Power" on the front page. So that was the first time you ever saw that slogan. And we had another cover, "The streets belong to the people." You know, there were a lot of phrases came out of those early underground paper days. So anyway, while I was in LA, Hunter Thompson came visiting, and he was staying in a hotel, and he was there to publicize his book about Hell's Angels. So I took him a bag of dope, and we spent the afternoon getting stoned and talking about life, and he turned out to be a very friendly contact and wrote for my paper many times afterwards. Well, the other thing was that I went to Stinson Beach, where the guy who was behind Woodstock later on held the first underground press syndicate conference with all these underground editors from all over the country meeting for the very first time. One of the people there was an American Indian called Rolling Cloud or something like that, and he hinted that the Indians had always had, he welcomed the idea of the underground press. He hinted that the Indians had always had this secret communication system that, you know, that they didn't need newspapers and telephones for and stuff. And one of the things he suggested that be done to curb authority is to encircle it. And he said, I think that the Pentagon should be encircled, which actually came to pass a couple of years later. The Pentagon was encircled. And that was the famous occasion when you might have heard about when people were putting flowers in the bayonets of the soldiers who were holding them off and stuff. And it was a very big time, you know, very big time for revolution, and a time that really changed the world, along with, I would like to think, the underground papers. So on the way back, I go to London, and I meet my friend Oz, Richard Neville from Oz, and he'd been kicked out of Australia more or less because there's a Pacific and Orient building, the P&O building, that has a sort of a balcony like that, a knee-high balcony in front of the building, and the editors of Oz were all photographed peeing into it, and that made them very unpopular, so they realized that Oz was no longer viable in Australia, and they'd better restart in London. So by the time I got to London, they were you know, well on the way, and Richard and I agreed we'd do a joint issue. Some of it would be other scenes, my newspaper, and my about-to-be newspaper.
This being that issue.
And while I was in Paris, I picked up this picture, without this picture on it, I picked up these people who were all at the gates of Buckingham Palace, because in those days, when people were executed, they'd put the picture on the gates of Buckingham Palace. And one of the people that I insisted that Richard and I go and visit was Michael X. Not Malcolm X, but Michael X, the London equivalent. And I learned something that day, which was that powerful people that you go and visit always put a front man out first. They don't appear immediately. For example, during the Warhol years, we were invited to a midnight screening at a place on 57th Street, one of the theatres that has a long approach to it from the sidewalk. And all 7 of us got out of the limousine, and Gerard Malangu was in front and approached the movie theatre, and they the owner of the movie theatre, or the manager of the movie theatre, came out to meet him, thought that Gerard was Warhol, and for the rest of the night continued to think that Gerard was Warhol. Warhol being Warhol, never bothered to enlighten him, because that's exactly the kind of thing that they absolutely loved, you know. So anyway, to get...
Well, you know, John, we've got like about 20 minutes technically.
Oh dear, well, I'm afraid we'll never finish.
Yeah. So maybe why don't we, you know, come to some highlights, you know, think of... and of course, I'd love to hear more about Warhol.
I have Tom Facade, Marijuana, Soho Confidential, Traveling in Venezuela, the Warhol Years, all kinds of stuff.
Let's start with Warhol Years and see where that
All right,
takes us.
I'll start with the one. The notes I made for the Warhol Years, because I do get asked about Warhol a lot.
Now, you wrote a book called The Sex Life of Andy Warhol.
Well, it's, yes,
tell us about...
I'll tell the story in order. While I was still at The Voice, writing my column, I was approached by a guy called Jonas Mekas, who ran Cinematheque in New York, which is the experimental movie people. And he said, you've got to go and see a movie by Andy Warhol. And I said, well, I've been to Cinematheque, Jonas, and I'll never go again because it's horrible. I said, the movies are out of sync, the sound's terrible, the visuals are terrible. I said, you can't tell what's happening, it's stupid. He said, no, he said, but you've got to go and see a Warhol movie. And I persisted in trying to refuse this, and he finally persuaded me, and I went to a Warhol movie. Well, I forget what it was, but the reaction to the movie was incredibly more sensational than the movie itself. People were shouting and screaming and throwing things at the screen and complaining